Imagine being trapped in the middle of nowhere. No escape, no backup, just seconds away from annihilation. When suddenly 3 gunshots change everything. But it wasn't the soldiers, it wasn't the commanders, it was a simple woman in a Blackhawk helicopter. And this is the untold story that will flip everything you thought you knew about strength. Why only 3 shots? Who was she? And how did she turn a massacre into a miracle? If you believe ordinary people can rewrite destiny, subscribe to A Simple Woman right now, because this story will blow your mind. Imagine being trapped in the middle of nowhere, a convoy carrying not weapons but the wounded, medics and civilians. Imagine every path ahead blocked, every line of retreat cut, and the walls of a jagged ravine pressing in like a coffin. There was no backup, no air support. Just dust, smoke, and the cold realization that the end had arrived. The clock wasn't ticking down. It had already struck 0. The convoy was cornered, and all that remained was silence before the storm of defeat. But then, something impossible happened. Not a barrage of rockets, not a rain of artillery, just 3 shots, 3 single bursts that shattered the night, rewrote the battlefield, and turned despair into a legend. And when people later asked who had pulled the trigger, the answer wasn't a general, wasn't an ace pilot, wasn't even a hardened soldier. It was a simple woman, Elena Ward, at the controls of a Blackhawk helicopter. What she did in that moment shouldn't have been possible. And yet, because of those 3 shots, hundreds walked away alive. If you think you know what strength looks like, if you believe victory only belongs to the biggest armies and the strongest men, this story will break that illusion, because sometimes courage is quiet. Sometimes hope wears the face no one expects. And if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things, if you believe that destiny can be rewritten by someone the world dismissed, then subscribe to A Simple Woman right now. Because this story is not just another war tale, it's proof that one ordinary woman at the right moment can change everything. Now, let's rewind. Hours before those 3 shots cut through the air, the convoy known as Guardian Column was crawling through a barren stretch of land called the Ravine. The name was earned honestly. Steep cliffs on either side, jagged rock formations that trapped sound and light, and a history soaked in defeat. 3 convoys had attempted the crossing before. 3 convoys had vanished, swallowed by ambushes and fire, and yet orders demanded that Guardian Column move forward. Supplies were running low, lives were at stake, and the only path forward was through this graveyard. Commander Rains sat in the lead vehicle, his jaw clenched, eyes locked on the narrow road ahead. He was a man carved by battle, but even he could feel the weight of history pressing down. Every soldier in Bravo unit, the escort tasked with keeping the convoy safe, knew the stories. They weren't marching into unknown danger. They were marching into certain doom. The only question was how long they could last once the attack began. Dust clouds rose behind armored trucks, engines growling under the strain of the climb. Medics tended to the wounded inside cramped vehicles, whispering prayers they didn't dare say out loud. The silence was heavy, broken only by the grind of metal and the occasional cough of an engine. No one wanted to speak. Speaking meant admitting what they all knew, that they were being funneled into a kill zone. High above, the sky was a dull grey, the kind of sky that seemed to press down, suffocating. And somewhere out there, beyond the cliffs, hidden eyes watched. Fingers hovered near triggers. The ravine had claimed its victims before, and it was ready to claim them again. The convoy slowed as the road narrowed further, boxed in by cliffs that seemed to lean closer with every passing yard. It was the kind of silence that suffocated, not because it was peaceful, but because it was waiting. Everyone knew what came next, and yet they drove on. Because turning back wasn't an option, because surrender was unthinkable, because sometimes survival is simply about buying one more minute, even when you know those minutes are running out. Commander Rains scanned the ridgelines through dust-stained windows, his knuckles white as he gripped the radio handset. He wanted to believe there was still a chance, some miracle waiting to happen, but all he saw was stone and shadow. He glanced at his men, seasoned fighters of Bravo Unit, and saw the truth mirrored in their eyes. They weren't afraid of battle, they were afraid of inevitability. And inevitability in the ravine always spelled death. Inside the rear vehicles, a medic named Silver tied off a bandage on a boy no older than 17, his face pale, lips trembling. The boy wasn't a soldier. He was one of the civilians they had picked up during the retreat from a ruined village. His eyes darted to the dark cliffs and then to Silver's calm face. "We're not getting out, are we?" he whispered. Silver paused, hand stilling, then forced a smile she didn't feel. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she answered, but her voice cracked, betraying the fear she couldn't bury. Engines rumbled louder as the path curved sharply, and suddenly the front of the convoy disappeared around a bend. That was the moment everyone had been dreading, the blind corner. If an ambush waited there, the convoy would be split in two, trapped with no chance to maneuver. Rains grabbed the radio, ready to order his men into defensive formation. But before he could speak, the crackle of static drowned him out. Then came silence. Then came the first shot. It wasn't aimed at them, not yet. It was a warning, a declaration. From the cliffs above, echoes rolled down like thunder, rattling nerves and shattering the illusion of hope. Soldiers leapt from the trucks, forming a shaky perimeter, rifles raised toward shadows they couldn't see. Every instinct screamed that this was the end. The ambush had begun. And then the second shot came, closer, sharper, tearing through the fragile courage that held the convoy together. Dust poured from the cliffside where a round had struck stone. Bravo Unit tightened formation, but their movements lacked conviction. They had seen this before. They knew what came next. Fire would rain down, the road would choke with smoke, and the ravine would earn another victory. And just when despair settled like a final curtain, a distant thrum whispered across the sky. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the pounding of hearts and the metallic clatter of weapons being readied. But then it grew louder, steadier, a rhythm unlike anything else. Rotor blades slicing air, a shadow crossing the haze, heads tilted upward, eyes narrowing in disbelief. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But there it was, the unmistakable shape of a Blackhawk helicopter cutting across the canyon mouth. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the enemy held its fire, stunned by the apparition that descended from the smoke. And as it drew nearer, a voice inside every soldier's head whispered the same question. Who would be reckless enough or brave enough to fly into the ravine? The sound of the helicopter's blades grew heavier, echoing through the narrow walls of the ravine like a heartbeat against stone. Dust rose from the ground, swirling in angry spirals as if the air itself resisted this sudden intrusion. Soldiers of Bravo Unit squinted upward, one hand shielding their eyes, the other tightening nervously around their rifles. The convoy had been cornered, and now something foreign, something unexpected, had entered the stage. But was it friend or foe? Commander Rains pressed the radio to his ear, cycling through channels, desperate for a signal, a voice, any confirmation. Static. Only static. His mind raced, No orders had been given, no support had been promised. Whoever was in that Blackhawk was not part of the official plan. That meant one of two things: salvation or slaughter. On the cliffs above, the enemy stirred. Shadows moved, rifles glinted, figures shifted from cover to cover. They had waited for this moment, the moment when the convoy's fate was sealed, when escape was impossible. And now, confronted with a helicopter they hadn't accounted for, hesitation fractured their confidence. Fingers hovered over triggers, but none dared fire first. The Blackhawk was more than metal and rotor blades. It was uncertainty, and uncertainty kills faster than bullets. Inside the convoy, fear and hope collided in fragile hearts. Silver, the medic, held the boy close, whispering, "It's help. It has to be help." The boy's eyes widened, lips trembling as he stared at the descending shadow. Bravo Unit Sergeant Ramirez barked at his men to hold their line, but his voice cracked, betraying disbelief. They had seen aircraft before. Aircraft that bombed, that destroyed, that burned everything in their path. But this one was different. No missiles, no screaming gunfire, just presence. And then, as the Blackhawk hovered above the canyon floor, its floodlight pierced the haze. A sharp cone of white light cut through smoke and shadow, sweeping across the convoy, across the cliffs, across the faces of men ready to kill and men ready to die. For a heartbeat, the battlefield was frozen in place, every figure illuminated, every secret revealed. And in that frozen second, all eyes found her. Elena Ward. Hands steady on the controls, jaw set with unshakable resolve, eyes narrowed against the storm of dust. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to fly this mission. She wasn't even supposed to matter. To most, she was the clipboard pilot, the woman who charted maps, logged flight hours, and ferried supplies. And yet here she was, lowering a Blackhawk into the jaws of hell, alone. The enemy commander finally raised his hand. A signal. Gunfire erupted from the cliffs, tracers streaking down like vengeful stars. The air cracked with thunder, the smell of cordite filling lungs, the screech of ricochets bouncing off armored plating. Bravo Unit returned fire in desperate bursts, the canyon transforming into a storm of chaos. Rocks splintered, dust geysers erupted, and the convoy shuddered under the hail. Rain slammed the radio down and shouted over the din, "Hold your ground, don't break!" His men fought, but already cracks showed. One truck's windshield shattered, screams rose from the rear vehicles, and the enemy's momentum grew like a tide. This was what the Ravine always did. Grind courage into dust, swallow hope, leave only silence. And yet above it all, the Blackhawk hovered. Its rotors carved through smoke, its shadow loomed, its spotlight never wavered. And in the cockpit, Elena's voice whispered words only she could hear. Not today. Not like this. The canyon shook as the firefight escalated. Bullets tore chunks from the cliffside, fragments raining down like deadly hail. Sparks ricocheted off armored vehicles, flames licked at tires, and the convoy screamed under the pressure. Soldiers ducked behind steel and stone, some clutching their rifles, others clutching each other. The ravine was alive, its walls echoing with thunder, its belly feeding on fear. Commander Rains barked orders through the chaos, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of combat. He turned, scanning for answers, for hope, for anything that might shift the tide. His eyes landed on the Blackhawk. Still hovering, still steady, still refusing to leave. He couldn't believe it. Whoever was flying that machine wasn't just defying orders. They were defying death itself. "Why isn't it firing?" Ramirez shouted, crouching low beside a shattered truck. "If it's here to help, why doesn't it shoot?" His words captured the question haunting everyone. The Blackhawk circled like a phantom, floodlight cutting arcs through the smoke, but its guns remained silent. Every second it held its fire, more men fell, more screams echoed, more hope bled away. Inside the helicopter, Elena Ward's hands hovered over the controls. Her headset crackled with voices, warnings, pleas, disbelief, but she tuned them out. Her mind raced, replaying maps, calculating angles, remembering every line she had studied, every note she had scribbled on her clipboard. She had one chance, just one. And if she wasted it, the ravine would swallow Guardian Column whole. Her eyes scanned the cliffs, tracing the hidden lines of the ambush. There, the ridge where the enemy commander signaled. There, the emplacement of the heavy gun pinning Bravo unit down. And there, the blockade sealing the road ahead. 3 points, 3 problems. And if she solved them with precision, just 3 bullets could crack the impossible wide open. Back on the ground, Silver shielded the boy with her own body as another burst of gunfire shredded the side of their truck. "Stay down!" she screamed, heart hammering. The boy clung to her, eyes locked not on the shooters, but on the Blackhawk above. "Why doesn't she do something?" he cried. Silver had no answer. She only knew that if the helicopter left, they were finished. If it stayed, maybe, just maybe, a miracle. The enemy pressed harder. More shadows spilled onto the ridges, muzzle flashes blazing, voices shouting in triumph. They believed the battle was already theirs. They believed the ravine had claimed another convoy. But then, amid the storm of noise, something changed. The Blackhawk rose higher, rotors howling, floodlights snapping upward like a stage cue. For a second, it hovered in perfect stillness, every eye drawn to it, every heartbeat hanging in suspense. Elena inhaled, slow, steady. The world narrowed until all that remained were those 3 targets. She whispered under her breath, words no one else could hear. 3 shots. That's all I need. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the silence before the storm stretching into eternity. And then the first shot rang out. The first shot split the air like lightning. It wasn't a wild spray or a desperate barrage. It was deliberate, clean, and mercilessly precise. The round tore across the canyon and smashed into the ridge where the enemy commander had stood, barking orders moments before. The flash of impact sent stone fragments spraying, the echo cracking through the ravine like thunder. Silence followed for half a heartbeat, and then chaos erupted. The chain of command was severed in an instant. Fighters on the cliffside froze, heads snapping toward the blast, shouts of confusion ricocheting off the stone walls. Down below, Bravo unit lifted their heads in disbelief. Ramirez blinked through dust and smoke, muttering, "No way, no way, she just..." But the evidence was clear. With a single shot, the Blackhawk had ripped the head from the serpent. For the first time that day, Bravo unit's breaths came not in despair, but in awe. The second shot came before the echo of the first had even faded. Elena's hands moved like extensions of her will, her eyes locked on the heavy emplacement spitting fire down on the convoy. She squeezed the trigger, the weapon's recoil surging through her body, and the round streaked across the canyon like a falling star. It struck the gun nest dead center, an explosion blooming as metal twisted and bodies scattered. The roar of the emplacement was silenced, and suddenly the storm of suppressing fire that had pinned Bravo unit down was gone. Soldiers on the ground looked up, their faces bathed in the sudden relief of silence. And in that silence, courage stirred. Rain slammed his fist against the dashboard, his eyes wide, his voice ragged as he shouted over the din. "She's clearing the field. Hold your ground. Push forward." For the first time since entering the ravine, his words carried more than desperation. They carried possibility. Soldiers rose from cover, returning fire with renewed ferocity. The convoy, once a cluster of trapped prey, began to look like fighters again. But Elena wasn't finished. Her eyes burned with focus, sweat dripping into the corners, hair whipping loose from her bun as the cockpit rattled with each maneuver. She saw the third target. The blockade stretched across the narrow road ahead, a hulking barricade of steel and debris designed to trap the convoy once the killing was done. Without removing it, no one was leaving the ravine alive. This shot mattered most of all. She steadied her breathing. Her hands flexed on the controls, adjusting for the crosswind, the shifting smoke, the trembling of the rotors. Her world shrank again. 1 point, 1 shot, 1 chance. She whispered the same words she had whispered before. 3 shots. That's all I need. She pulled the trigger. The third round tore through the canyon, streaking toward the blockade. For an instant, the world held its breath. Then the impact detonated, fire curling outward, debris shattering, steel shrieking as it collapsed. The barricade didn't just break, it disintegrated, ripped apart by the force, scattering burning fragments across the canyon floor. A gaping path now yawned open, leading straight out of the ravine. The convoy erupted in shouts, a sound closer to joy than to war. Soldiers pounded their rifles against the ground. Medics wept against the shoulders of those they'd been protecting, and Commander Rains felt something he hadn't felt in years, genuine hope. 3 shots, that was all it had taken. 3 shots, fired by a woman no one had expected, had broken the curse of the ravine. The explosion of the third shot rolled like thunder through the canyon, a wave of force that rattled bones and sent a shower of sparks cascading into the dust-choked air. For a moment there was no gunfire, no shouts, no sound at all, only stunned silence. The blockade that had sealed their fate was gone, reduced to twisted wreckage and flames. A path stood open. The impossible had been carved away in 3 deliberate strikes. On the cliffs, the enemy faltered. Fighters who had moments ago been pressing their advantage now stumbled back in confusion, their formation unraveling. Without their commander, without their heavy guns, and without the blockade to trap the convoy, the certainty of victory bled out of them like air from a punctured lung. What remained was fear. They had never planned for this, never imagined that precision and audacity could undo their stranglehold in an instant. And fear spreads faster than fire. Bravo units surged with renewed energy. Ramirez shouted orders that rang with steel rather than desperation. "Advance! Cover the trucks! Push them through the gap!" Soldiers leapt from cover, rifles spitting controlled fire, no longer the hunted but the hunters. The convoy roared to life, engines snarling as drivers slammed accelerators, steering wounded vehicles toward the path Elena had carved. Tires spun on gravel, armored hulls scraped against stone, but the column began to move. The ravine, once a tomb, was becoming a passage. Inside one of the rear trucks, Silva clutched the boy she had promised to protect. Tears streamed down her dirt-streaked face as she realized what she was witnessing. "Do you see it?" she whispered, voice trembling with awe. The boy nodded, eyes wide, lips shaping words he couldn't speak. Hope was no longer a dream. It was right there, blazing across the canyon sky with each beat of rotor blades. Commander Rains, gripping the side of his vehicle, craned his neck to look at the Blackhawk hovering above. His lips parted, words spilling out, half a prayer, half a confession. "Whoever you are, you just saved us all." For a man who had been ready to surrender, to lay down his pride and his men, in exchange for mercy, The realization was a dagger and a lifeline at once. One woman, one helicopter, and 3 shots had done what he could not: resurrect belief. Above it all, Elena Ward sat in the cockpit, her breaths heavy but controlled, her gaze steady. She had calculated, she had trusted, and she had delivered. The voices in her headset screamed with disbelief, call signs she didn't recognize demanding to know who was flying, commanders shouting over each other, disbelief giving way to frantic orders, but she tuned them out. All that mattered was below her, pushing forward, breaking free. For a fleeting moment she allowed herself to look down, to see the faces turned upward toward her. Awe, gratitude, reverence. It was not pride that filled her. It was something sharper, something humbler. A truth she had always known but had never been allowed to prove. That courage was not reserved. For the chosen few, that power did not come from rank or medals, but from resolve. Then the moment ended. The enemy, though shaken, was not broken. Gunfire sparked again along the ridges, a desperate attempt to claw back control. Tracers lanced the sky, one round striking dangerously close to the Blackhawk's tail. Elena gritted her teeth, banking hard, rotors screaming in protest. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but it had changed. And no matter what happened next, one fact was undeniable. The Ravine would never again be remembered as the place where convoys died. It would be remembered as the place where a simple woman with 3 shots rewrote destiny. The convoy surged forward like blood rushing back into a dead heart. Engines screamed, wheels bit into gravel, and armored hulls groaned as drivers pushed their battered machines through the newly opened path. For the first time since entering the ravine, momentum was on their side. The roar of machinery was no longer a dirge, it was a battle cry. Bravo unit moved with a unity they had thought lost. Moments before, their bodies had sagged under the weight of defeat, their eyes hollow, their voices subdued. Now, fire burned in their veins. Ramirez led the charge, his boots pounding against stone as he laid down, suppressing fire with ferocity. Every bullet he fired was no longer an act of desperation, but of defiance. He shouted commands that his men followed instantly, their formation crisp, their rhythm alive. They weren't clinging to survival anymore, they were seizing it. The wounded inside the trucks stirred, the rhythm of the convoy's push sparking something long dormant. Silver gripped the boy's shoulder as the vehicle lurched forward, jostling them both. "We're moving," she said, and this time her voice didn't crack. It rang with conviction. The boy's eyes lit up wide and trembling, as if the impossible had suddenly become tangible. "We're going to make it," he whispered, more to himself than to her. And for the first time, Silver believed it too. Commander Rain stood tall in the hatch of the lead vehicle, one hand braced against the steel, the other pointing forward. His voice boomed across radios and over the din of engines. "Push through! The road is open! Do not stop for anything!" His face, weathered by years of war, bore a new expression, something that looked like pride, something that felt like redemption. The man who had nearly surrendered now led with a fire that his men couldn't ignore. Above, Elena guided the Blackhawk in sweeping arcs, her spotlight carving paths through the smoke. She wasn't just firing anymore, she was directing. Every movement of the helicopter drew the convoy's eyes upward, every shift in her position a signal of protection. To them, she wasn't a pilot, she was a sentinel, a guardian hovering over their escape. The thump of her rotors became the drumbeat of their advance. On the ridges, the enemy scrambled, their advantage shattered. Some fired blindly, their shots wild and desperate, while others broke and ran, fear outweighing loyalty. The chain of terror that the ravine had wrapped around its victims for years was snapping link by link. What had been a kill zone was now a corridor carved open by 3 impossible shots, and the enemy could feel the ground shifting beneath them, their certainty crumbling. But the price was not erased. Vehicles smoked from earlier hits, soldiers limped from fresh wounds, and cries of the injured still punctured the air. This was not victory. Not yet. It was survival clawed from the jaws of certain death, fragile and incomplete. The convoy still had to cross the last stretch, still had to escape the walls of the ravine, still had to hold their line against enemies who would rather die than let them pass. And yet, even with those dangers looming, something fundamental had changed. Despair was gone. Hope, fierce and unyielding, had taken its place, and hope is a contagion, the kind that spreads faster than fear. The convoy thundered toward freedom, engines straining under the weight of desperation turned to resolve. Dust and smoke clung to every surface, streaking the windshields and staining the soldiers' faces, but no one slowed. Each meter gained was proof that the impossible had been broken, that the ravine's curse had finally met its match. From his position in the lead vehicle, Commander Rains felt the tide inside him shift. Hours earlier, he had been ready to trade honor for survival, to bend his pride in exchange for mercy. Now, as the trucks rattled over shattered debris and into the corridor Elena had carved, he knew surrender would never have bought this. It wasn't mercy that saved them. It was defiance, distilled into 3 shots that had ripped open a new reality. Bravo unit pressed their advantage with relentless precision. Ramirez led a flanking push, clearing enemy pockets that still tried to hold the ridges. His voice roared over the gunfire, cracking with exhilaration. "They're breaking! Keep pressing them! This is ours now!" The men followed him with renewed fury, their steps heavy but unshaken. They weren't fighting to delay defeat anymore. They were fighting to claim victory. Inside the convoy's middle truck, Silva braced herself against the swaying hull as she checked on her patients. The boy who had once whispered in despair now clutched her sleeve, his voice urgent. "She's still up there, isn't she?" Silva glanced through the narrow window. The Blackhawk hovered above, its silhouette etched against the haze, rotors chopping the air like the heartbeat of a giant. "Yes," Silva answered softly, her throat tight. "She's still here." The boy smiled, exhaustion and awe mingling on his pale face. For him, Elena wasn't just a pilot, she was proof that survival was possible. Everywhere, soldiers looked upward. Their weapons spat fire, but their eyes sought the helicopter. Elena had become the axis around which the battle turned, not through overwhelming firepower, but through belief. Belief that the tide could shift. Belief that they were not alone. Belief that a simple woman could defy the impossible. On the ridges, panic fractured the enemy lines. Some fighters fired in scattered bursts before retreating, while others cast down their weapons entirely, eyes wide with disbelief. The ravine, once their hunting ground, was slipping away. They had not prepared for this, had not planned for resilience born of hope. Fear clawed at them, and in their hesitation they lost control. Elena kept the Blackhawk steady, her eyes scanning the convoy below. She could see the wounded lifted onto stretchers, the soldiers covering each other's advance. The way their posture had changed. No longer bent under defeat, they moved like men and women who believed they might live to see another dawn. Sweat dripped into her eyes, but she didn't blink it away. She couldn't afford distraction. Every second she stayed aloft above the canyon was another second the convoy gained ground. And yet, even as the convoy pushed forward, danger loomed. Ammunition was running low. Engines coughed under strain. The enemy was regrouping further down the ravine, desperate to seal it shut again. Rains knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew something else. No matter what happened next, they were no longer victims. The convoy had become survivors. 3 shots had redrawn the lines of fate, and the echo of those shots would carry far beyond the ravine. Long before the Blackhawk descended into the ravine, Elena Ward had been dismissed as a background figure, a pilot whose greatest weapon was not her aircraft but her clipboard. Among soldiers hardened by years of combat, her presence was tolerated, even mocked. "There goes the map lady," they would whisper when she walked past, olive green, tank top hidden beneath her flight jacket, clipboard tucked under her arm. She carried no scars from battle, no medals gleamed on her chest. To most, she was just logistics. A cog in the machinery of war, not a blade in its hand. But what they never understood was that Elena saw differently. Where others saw terrain, she saw patterns. Where others saw chaos, she saw sequences. Nights in the barracks when others slept, she bent over maps and mission reports, tracing every engagement in the ravine, every ambush, every convoy lost. She memorized coordinates until they pulsed in her dreams, studied weather patterns until she could predict wind, shifts by the taste of the air, analyzed troop movements until she could see the logic behind the madness. And it wasn't just study. Elena had lived it. She had once been in a convoy swallowed by the ravine years before, a young pilot tasked with flying supplies. That day had ended in fire and screams. Her aircraft forced down, her comrades lost. She survived by hiding in the rocks, clutching her clipboard like a shield, etching every detail into her memory. The sounds of the ambush, the timing of the gunfire, the positions of the enemy snipers, they became scars in her mind. Scars that no one could see, but which shaped every step she took afterward. When she returned to duty, she tried to share what she had learned. She warned commanders about ambush points, about the patterns of attack, about the chokehold that the ravine used to crush morale before it crushed bodies. But few listened. A woman with no rank, no medals, no victories to her name, what could she possibly know? They gave her a clipboard, a badge, and the thankless work of ferrying supplies. And so she watched quietly as more convoys marched into doom. She recorded their fates. She filled page after page with notes no one would read. Yet all the while, she was building something. Not a weapon of steel, but of certainty. She charted every detail of the ravine until it was no longer terrain. It was a code, one she alone had cracked. And when the day came that Guardian column set out, Elena knew their path would cross the same deadly sequences. She also knew that no one else would see the key, so she made a decision. She would fly. She would bring her Blackhawk, not as an escort, not as a symbol, but as a scalpel. And with 3 precise strikes, she would carve open the ravine's code and break its curse. Back in the cockpit, as sweat dripped down her temple and her hands gripped the controls, Elena's mind wasn't in the present. It was everywhere at once. Every past ambush, every fallen convoy, every map she had memorized. Each shot she fired wasn't random chance. It was the culmination of years of invisible work, of ridicule endured, of visions dismissed. When she dropped the commander, silenced the gun nest, and shattered the blockade, she wasn't improvising. She was executing a plan she had rehearsed 1,000 times in silence, alone with her clipboard. The soldiers on the ground only saw the 3 shots. They saw steel collapse, ridges explode, and a path open where none had existed. What they could not see was the years behind those shots, The nights of studying by dim light, the humiliation of being ignored, the memories of comrades buried in the ravine's shadows. To them, she was a miracle. To Elena, it was mathematics, memory, and a will sharpened into something harder than steel. She had always carried the clipboard because it was the only weapon she had been given. But over time, the clipboard became more than paper and ink. It became her arsenal. Every line of data, every calculation, every observation was stored there. When the men laughed and asked her why she never carried a rifle, she had only smiled. A rifle fires bullets. Her clipboard fired certainty. And certainty, she believed, was deadlier than any gun. Her reputation as the clipboard pilot had stuck, and she wore it like armor. The nickname meant no one expected her to be dangerous. No one expected her to matter, and that invisibility became her strength. While others dismissed her, she listened. She watched, she collected. She turned their arrogance into her cover, and their oversight into her advantage. By the time the Guardian columns set out, Elena wasn't just prepared, she was inevitable. Commander Rains didn't know her history as he stared up at the Blackhawk, but he felt its weight. He had doubted her before, written her off as little more than a background presence. Yet now, in the most desperate hour of his command, it was her preparation, her defiance that lifted them from the grave. And though he would never admit it aloud, a part of him knew, without the clipboard pilot, he would already be dead. Bravo unit felt it too. Ramirez, whose voice had once echoed with skepticism, found himself muttering words he never thought he would say. She knew. She always knew. His men repeated it like a mantra, half disbelief, half worship. In the chaos of war, belief is as powerful as bullets. And now, every soldier in that convoy believed in Elena Ward. In the cockpit, Elena allowed herself no celebration. Her eyes stayed fixed, her mind calculating the next risk, the next angle, the next threat. She knew the story wasn't over. The ravine would not surrender so easily, and neither would its masters. But for the first time since that cursed canyon had swallowed her friends years ago, she felt something shift. The ravine was no longer invincible. She had cracked its code, and with that crack, light was flooding in. Later, when survivors told the story, they would embellish it. They would call her a ghost, a savior, an angel of war. They would paint her as larger than life. But the truth was simpler. Elena Ward was just a woman who had studied harder, endured longer, and believed deeper than anyone else. She didn't rewrite destiny by accident. She rewrote it because she refused to forget. 3 shots were the final punctuation to a story she had been writing all along. And as the convoy surged forward, as hope thundered back into hearts that had gone still, one truth crystallized. For all who had witnessed it, a clipboard can be heavier than a rifle if the one who holds it refuses to let go. The ravine was wounded, but it wasn't dead. Even as the convoy roared forward through the gap Elena had carved, the enemy rallied in desperation. Fresh muzzle flashes sparked along the ridges, shadows regrouping, trying to pour fire into the open path. The canyon trembled with the renewed fury of men who realized their prey was slipping away. "Bravo unit moved to meet the surge," Ramirez bellowed, his voice carrying like thunder. "Hold the line! Cover the convoy! Nobody falls back!" His men scrambled into positions along the moving column, rifles blazing, their bodies forming a shield of grit and determination. Bullets hissed overhead, carving lines of fire through the smoke. Vehicles jolted as rounds punched into their armor, but the column refused to slow. Every second counted. Every second was life or death. Commander Rain stood half exposed from the hatch of the lead vehicle, his sidearm clutched tight, firing into the cliffs. Dust coated his face, streaking with sweat, but his eyes burned with focus. He knew this was the final stretch. They were close, so close, but the enemy would rather die than watch them escape. "Keep moving," he roared. "Don't let them close the gap." Above, the Blackhawk swooped low, rotors tearing the air into violent whirlwinds. Elena's spotlight cut across the canyon, blinding shooters, scattering formations. She banked hard, pulling the helicopter into impossible maneuvers, weaving through tracer fire that clawed for her in the sky. The Blackhawk wasn't just a machine. It was an omen, a storm breaking the stranglehold of the ravine. But the enemy had saved their deadliest card for last. From the far end of the canyon, the ground trembled as a massive armored vehicle rolled into view, its cannon swiveling toward the convoy. The blockade had been shattered, but this monster was meant to finish what the traps could not. Its silhouette loomed through the smoke, iron and menace fused into one. Soldiers on the ground gasped. Even Ramirez's defiance faltered for a heartbeat. Silver clutched the boy tighter as the truck they rode in shuddered from another near miss. Her eyes widened at the sight of the armored beast. "No," she whispered, voice cracking. The boy buried his face against her chest, unwilling to watch the doom approaching. Rains slammed his fist against steel, cursing under his breath. They had no heavy weapons left, no artillery, nothing that could punch through that armor. One shot from that cannon would rip the convoy apart. For a split second, despair clawed back into his chest. The 3 miraculous shots had given them a path, but this new enemy threatened to erase it all. Up in the cockpit, Elena's jaw clenched. Her fuel gauge dipped low, her ammunition nearly spent, but her eyes locked onto the armored vehicle, and she knew the battle would not be decided by hesitation. She tightened her grip on the controls, pushing the Blackhawk lower, closer to the teeth of the monster. Her rotors screamed as the canyon walls funneled the sound into a deafening roar. She whispered to herself again, steady as ever, "Not today." She pulled the Blackhawk into a dive, engines howling, closing the distance. Every soldier below lifted their gaze, hearts suspended in terror and awe. Elena Ward was aiming the storm itself at the beast in their path. The armored beast rumbled forward, its treads grinding the earth, its cannon lowering like the judgment of a god. Smoke curled from its vents, the hiss of hydraulics mixing with the thunder of battle. Every soldier knew what it meant. One shot from that gun would tear the convoy apart, reduce their fragile victory to ashes. The ravine had played its final card, and it was devastating. Bravo units scrambled, unleashing a barrage of fire that clattered uselessly against the steel giant. Sparks bloomed, but the armor held, unmoved, indifferent. Ramirez cursed, teeth bared, but he didn't stop firing. "Keep it distracted," he roared. Even as he knew their bullets were pebbles thrown at a mountain, fear crept into the ranks again, sharp and merciless. Commander Rain slammed the radio, barking orders with a voice that strained to mask dread. "Get those trucks moving! Don't stop! If we hesitate now, we're finished." His men obeyed, engines roaring, but the convoy was still in range. The monster's cannon swiveled, locking onto the lead vehicle. And then, above the chaos, came the roar of rotors. Elena drove the Blackhawk into a dive, the sky itself screaming as her machine plunged toward the armored vehicle. The floodlight blazed, cutting through smoke and fear alike, pinning the beast in its glare. Every eye tracked her descent, every heartbeat pounding in sync with the helicopter's furious rhythm. The armored vehicle fired. A flash of hell burst from its cannon, the round screaming toward the convoy, but Elena was already moving. She banked hard, tilting the Blackhawk on its side, the cannon blast tearing past her belly by inches. The explosion rocked the canyon, shrapnel lancing the air, but she held steady. She had no heavy missiles, no rockets. What she had was precision, and the last of her ammunition. Her hands didn't tremble, her eyes didn't blink. She had spent years preparing for this. Years carrying a clipboard no one respected. Every calculation, every observation, every memory of the ravine led to this moment. She squeezed the trigger. The round streaked through the smoke, straight and merciless. It struck the armored vehicle's exhaust port, the weakest point she had marked in her endless studies. The impact roared like thunder, flames bursting from within. The beast shuddered, groaned, then erupted, fire swallowing it whole. A wave of heat and smoke blasted outward, rolling across the canyon like a second sunrise. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Soldiers froze mid-step. Even the enemy stood paralyzed, their final weapon now nothing more than a burning carcass. Then the silence broke, not with despair, but with a sound that had been absent for too long. Cheers! Bravo units' voices rose, raw and feral, echoing across the stone. The convoy surged forward, trucks barreling through the gap, their path now clear. Silver clutched the boy as the truck jolted, tears streaking her face. "We're free," she whispered, her voice breaking. The boy pressed his face to the window, eyes wide as the flames reflected in them. "She did it," he breathed. Commander Rains lowered his weapon, staring up at the Blackhawk circling above. His voice, gravel and steel, softened into reverence. "Elena Ward," he said quietly. "You've done what no army could." Elena steadied the Blackhawk, breathing hard, her body trembling with the toll. But her eyes remained sharp, her resolve unbroken. She didn't need to hear their cheers. She didn't need their praise. She only needed to see the convoy rolling free, leaving the ravine's grip behind. That was enough. And as the burning wreckage crackled behind them, one truth seared itself into the memory of every soul who had lived that day. The ravine was no longer a graveyard. It was the place where a simple woman with 3 game-changing shots ended its reign of fear. The convoy rolled out of the ravine like survivors escaping the mouth of a beast. Smoke still curled from shattered vehicles, and the cries of the wounded still pierced the air, but they were moving forward. Every mile placed between them and the canyon felt like stolen time, a gift they were never supposed to have. And above, circling with the patience of a guardian, the Blackhawk lingered, its shadows still stretching across the ground like a vow. Bravo units sat slumped against their trucks, weapons resting on their knees, exhaustion mingling with relief. Ramirez pulled off his helmet, sweat streaming down his temples, his chest rising and falling like a man who had sprinted through hell and lived to tell it. His eyes drifted skyward, watching the Blackhawk, and a grin broke across his dirt-streaked face. "Clipboard pilot," he muttered, shaking his head. "Guess we were all fools." Commander Rains was quieter. He leaned against the lead vehicle, arms folded, gaze locked on the path behind them. He had faced death before, had lost men before, but never had he felt the sting of nearly surrendering. The decision haunted him still. Yet when he turned to look at the helicopter, his guilt eased, replaced by something sharper, humility. It wasn't his command that saved them. It wasn't his strategy. It was her, a woman he had underestimated, overlooked, and almost ignored. Now her name would be etched into his memory until the day he died. Inside one of the trucks, Silver finally allowed herself to rest. The boy she had protected slept against her shoulder, exhaustion pulling him into dreams. She brushed dirt from his hair and let her eyes close, whispering softly, "You're safe now." Her voice broke with relief. because she knew it was true. Against all odds, they had survived. And the reason was not firepower or superior numbers, but 3 precise shots fired by someone no one had expected. Elena Ward, hovering above, didn't hear their words. Her headset buzzed with chatter from command, questions piling one over the other, disbelief and reprimand mixing in equal measure. She tuned them out, her gaze fixed on the convoy below. To her, victory wasn't medals or recognition. It was movement. It was life. It was seeing those trucks break free from the Ravine's curse. That was enough. For years she had been dismissed, reduced to her clipboard, her calculations, her warnings that went unheard. But on this day, in this canyon, the world had no choice but to listen. Her actions had spoken louder than any title or rank could have. And in those 3 shots, she had proven a truth too often forgotten, that strength doesn't always wear the face we expect. Sometimes it looks like a simple woman refusing to back down. The smoke from the ravine still curled behind them, but the weight it had carried was gone. The canyon that once meant certain death had been broken, rewritten not by an army but by a single act of defiance. Survivors would tell the story in different ways. Some would remember the roar of the Blackhawk, others the fire of those 3 shots, others still the impossible timing that saved their lives. But no matter how they told it, one truth remained: without Elena Ward, there would have been no story at all. In the days that followed, whispers spread through every camp, every barracks, every mess hall. The clipboard pilot, they said, shaking their heads in disbelief. The one who opened the ravine. Soldiers who had once laughed at her now spoke her name with reverence. To some, she was a legend already, a ghost who appeared when hope was gone. To others, she was a reminder that the overlooked, the underestimated, the dismissed could hold the power to change everything. Commander Rains filed his report, and though he struggled with the words, one line came easily: she turned defeat into survival. He had commanded countless missions, but none had left him so humbled. He had nearly given up. She had not. And because of that, men and women who should have died would live to see another dawn. That truth would mark him forever. Silver told her patients the story as she patched their wounds. She described the helicopter hovering against the firelit sky, the impossible precision of 3 shots, the courage in the face of certain death. And when the boy asked her why she thought Elena had done it, Silver smiled faintly, brushing dirt from her own tired face. Because she refused to let us be forgotten, she said. Because someone had to believe we were worth saving. Elena herself said nothing. When asked by command for explanations, she gave none. When pressed about why she had risked her life, she shrugged. To her the answer was simple: because it had to be done. Because she could not bear to let the ravine claim another convoy. Recognition meant little. Survival was enough. But those who had been there would never forget. They would carry the memory like a flame, a reminder that sometimes the strongest weapon on the battlefield is not firepower, but resolve. That sometimes the most extraordinary act comes from the most ordinary figure. And that sometimes all it takes is 3 game-changing shots to turn despair into hope. This isn't just another war story. It's proof. Proof that courage is not about who carries the heaviest weapon, but about who refuses to give up when all seems lost. Proof that a simple woman, overlooked and underestimated, can stand in the fire and rewrite the fate of hundreds. And if you believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, if you believe that hope can rise from the unlikeliest of places, then this is your story too. Subscribe to A Simple Woman right now, because the next story might just change the way you see yourself.